Somewhere in the lower levels of the Mohenjo-daro excavation, archaeologists working in the 1920s noted something that would take decades to fully register as strange. They had uncovered a city, streets laid in grids, drainage systems more sophisticated than anything contemporary in Egypt or Mesopotamia, uniform brick sizes repeated across hundreds of miles. And yet in none of the buildings, in none of the carefully ordered rooms, in none of the storage chambers or public structures, did they find what every other early civilization had left behind in abundance. There were no temples identifiable as such, no royal burial chambers, no inscriptions commemorating rulers, no texts recording conquests, tributes, or divine lineages. The city was enormous, organized, and almost entirely silent about itself. The absence was not simply a gap in the record. It was the shape of the record. What the excavators had uncovered at Mohenjo-daro, and soon after at Harappa, and eventually at hundreds of other sites stretching across what is now Pakistan, northwestern India, and Afghanistan, was a civilization that had flourished for roughly 7 centuries at its height. Some estimates place the peak between 2600 and 1900 BCE, and had left behind almost no explanation of who governed it, what it believed, or why it ended. Other Bronze Age civilizations left palace archives. They left king lists. They left hymns, legal codes, administrative ledgers in the tens of thousands. The Indus Valley Civilization left seal impressions, a script no one has decoded, and a silence that grows heavier the longer it is studied. That silence is not uniform. It is not the silence of simple destruction or time. It has a shape, and the shape is peculiar. Certain categories of evidence are almost entirely absent. Others are present in unexpected density. The civilization built elaborate public baths, possibly for ritual use. It produced standardized weights and measures used across a territory larger than ancient Egypt or Sumer. It traded with Mesopotamia. There are Indus seals found in the ruins of Ur, and yet Mesopotamian records refer to a place called Meluha, possibly the Indus region, in terms suggesting commerce, but no Indus document has ever been found describing that trade from the other side. The records that should exist, given what the physical evidence implies about organizational complexity, do not. The records that do exist cannot be read. This is not one absence, it is two, and they press against each other in ways that resist easy explanation. The question that emerges is not simply whether the Indus script will ever be decoded, though that question haunts the field, but whether decoding it would even resolve the deeper silence, because the pattern of what is missing suggests something more than lost texts. It suggests a civilization that may have organized itself according to principles that left very little room for the kind of record-keeping that other ancient societies treated as essential. The glorification of rulers, the documentation of conquest, the inscription of divine authority in stone. Whether that reflects a different kind of governance, a different relationship to permanence and commemoration, or simply a different medium that has not survived, remains genuinely unknown. What is not unknown is that the silence persists. Across more than a century of excavation, across hundreds of sites, the Indus Valley Civilization has not yielded a single bilingual inscription, not a single royal tomb, not a single clearly identified temple with named deities, and not a single text longer than roughly 26 signs. For a civilization that endured for centuries across a territory of nearly 1 million square kilometers, that is not a gap in the record. It is the record refusing to open. And that refusal, patient and absolute, is where this investigation begins. The Indus script itself is where the silence becomes most concentrated and most contested. It exists. That much is certain. It appears on small stone seals, on copper tablets, on pottery, on ivory rods, on tiny objects whose function is still debated. Roughly 5,000 inscribed objects have been recovered across the known sites, and the script that appears on them uses somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs, depending on how signs are counted and grouped. That range alone, the uncertainty about something as basic as how many characters the script contains, gives some indication of how far the field remains from resolution. The inscriptions are short, strikingly, almost uniformly short. The average inscription contains fewer than 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains roughly 26. For comparison, the earliest Sumerian administrative tablets contain hundreds of signs per document. Egyptian hieroglyphic inscriptions run across temple walls for meters. Even the earliest linear B tablets from the Aegean, which are accounting records rather than literary texts, contain multiple lines of detailed information. The Indus inscriptions contain almost nothing by comparison, and yet they appear on objects that were clearly significant. Stamp seals used in commerce or administration, objects buried with the dead, objects found in what appear to be ritual or storage contexts. This brevity is one of the central puzzles of the script, and it cuts in 2 directions at once. One possibility, favored by some researchers, is that the inscriptions are primarily labels, names of individuals, titles, identifiers for goods or clans or offices. In this reading, the shortness of the inscriptions is functional rather than revealing. The script may have been used for a narrow administrative purpose, and the longer texts, if they existed, were written on materials that have not survived: bark, cloth, prepared leaves, wood. These would not persist in the archaeological record, and their absence would be expected rather than mysterious. The other possibility is more unsettling. Some researchers have argued that the script's consistent brevity across all known contexts suggests it was never used for extended writing at all, that it functioned more like a logographic or symbolic system of identifiers than like a fully developed script capable of representing continuous speech. In this view, the absence of long inscriptions is not an accident of preservation. It is a feature of what the script was designed to do. And if that is the case, then the Indus Valley Civilization may have conducted its entire administrative, religious, and civic life without anything resembling the written records that other Bronze Age societies considered indispensable. Neither position has been conclusively demonstrated because the script has not been decoded. Dozens of serious attempts have been made over the past century. Professional linguists, computational analysts, independent scholars, and teams using statistical methods have all proposed readings. None has achieved consensus. The fundamental obstacle is the absence of a bilingual key, something like the Rosetta Stone that unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics by providing the same text in a known and an unknown language. No Indus bilingual inscription has ever been found. The Mesopotamian records that mention trade with Meluhha are written in Sumerian and Akkadian and describe the exchange of goods, but they contain no Indus words rendered phonetically, no personal names that can be matched to Indus signs, no phrase that bridges the two systems. There is a further complication that is sometimes understated. The underlying language of the Indus script is also unknown. Proposals have ranged from a Proto-Dravidian language ancestral to the Tamil family, to an early Indo-Aryan language, to a language isolate with no known descendants. Without knowing what language the script encodes, or even whether it encodes a spoken language at all, decipherment cannot begin in any conventional sense. Every proposed reading rests on an assumption about the underlying language that has not been independently verified. What this means, in practical terms, is that the most direct route into the civilization's own account of itself remains closed. The seals sit in museum drawers in Karachi, New Delhi, and London, their signs intact and their meaning unreachable. And behind that closed door, something is waiting, or nothing is. The field cannot yet say which. The physical layout of the Indus cities is where the silence becomes architectural, and architecture is harder to dismiss than missing documents. Buildings can be misread, their purposes can be debated, but their presence and the deliberate absence of certain structures that every comparable civilization built as a matter of course is not a matter of interpretation. It is a matter of what stands and what does not. At Mohenjo-daro, the most extensively excavated of the major sites, the city is divided into two broad sections. There is a raised western mound, sometimes called the citadel, and a lower eastern section of residential and civic structures. The citadel contains what excavators identified as significant public buildings: a large water tank, often called the Great Bath, a structure sometimes interpreted as a granary or assembly hall, and several other substantial constructions whose functions remain disputed. The lower city contains streets arranged in rough grids, houses with interior courtyards, sophisticated drainage channels running beneath the streets, and workshops producing beads, pottery, and metal objects. What the citadel does not contain is equally important. There is no structure that can be confidently identified as a palace, no large residential complex with clearly demarcated quarters for an elite household, no throne room, no archive room, no treasury identifiable as such. There is no royal tomb anywhere in the city. Burials at Mohenjo-daro and other Indus sites tend toward the modest. Bodies interred with some pottery and personal ornaments, but without the dramatic wealth differentials that characterize elite burials in Egypt or Mesopotamia during the same period. The richest Indus burials found so far are distinguished by somewhat more elaborate grave goods, but the difference in scale between the richest and the most ordinary burials is far smaller than in contemporary civilizations. It is the kind of difference that speaks of hierarchy, perhaps, but not of the extreme social distance between rulers and rule that other Bronze Age societies expressed so plainly in their treatment of the dead. This pattern has led some researchers to propose that the Indus cities may have been governed not by kings or pharaoh-like figures, but by some form of collective authority, perhaps a council of merchants, perhaps a priestly class whose power was expressed through control of ritual rather than through military force or dynastic lineage, perhaps something with no precise parallel in the ancient world. Others are more cautious, arguing that the absence of obvious palaces and royal tombs does not prove the absence of kingship. The palace, they suggest, may simply have been built of materials that have not survived, or may await discovery at sites not yet excavated, or may have looked different enough from Mesopotamian or Egyptian models that archaeologists have not yet recognized it for what it was. The caution is legitimate. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the Indus Valley remains incompletely excavated. Of the more than 1,000 known Indus sites, only a small fraction have been systematically examined. Many lie beneath modern cities or agricultural land where excavation is difficult or impossible. The city of Gunwariwala, believed to be comparable in size to Mohenjo-daro, has never been properly excavated at all. Whatever it contains or does not contain remains unknown, and yet the pattern holds across the sites that have been excavated. No palace has been found, no royal tomb, no triumphal inscription. The uniformity of the absence across geographically dispersed sites, separated by hundreds of miles, is itself a form of evidence. Evidence that what is missing may not simply be the result of incomplete excavation at any single location, but of something more systematic. Either these cities genuinely did not build the monuments that other civilizations considered essential to power, or they built them in ways and in materials that have left no trace. Both possibilities point toward something fundamental about how this civilization understood itself and organized its world. That understanding, whatever it was, has not been transmitted. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro survives, watertight, carefully constructed, fed by a well and drained by a channel. Who used it, and for what purpose, and under whose authority, the walls do not say. The trade network of the Indus Valley Civilization is one of the most extensively documented aspects of its existence, and it is precisely here where the evidence is richest that the silence becomes most difficult to explain, because the Indus people traded. They traded widely, persistently, and over enormous distances. The physical proof of that trade sits in museums across 3 continents, and yet the records of that trade, on the Indus side, are essentially non-existent. The evidence of contact with Mesopotamia is not speculative. Indus seals, small, square, carved from steatite, bearing the characteristic script and animal imagery of the Indus tradition, have been found at at Lagash, and at other Mesopotamian sites dating to the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE. Carnelian beads of a type produced only in the Indus region using a distinctive etching technique not practiced anywhere else have turned up in royal graves at and in settlements across the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamian texts from roughly 2300 to 1900 BCE refer to a place called Meluha as a source of luxury goods, carnelian, lapis lazuli, processed or traded through Indus networks, timber, ivory, and possibly gold. The trade was real, and it was significant. It reached the highest levels of Mesopotamian society, including the royal court. What does not exist is a single Indus side document describing any of it. No ledger recording goods sent to Mesopotamia, no account of ships departing from the port city of Lothal, on the western coast of what is now Gujarat, which contains what appears to be a dockyard, one of the earliest known in the world, along with warehouses and Persian Gulf shells suggesting long-distance maritime contact. No list of trade partners, no record of prices, quantities, or disputes. If the Indus merchants kept such records, and the standardized weights found across the civilization suggest a level of commercial precision that would normally generate documentation, those records have not survived in any medium that has endured. This is where the question of perishable materials becomes most consequential. Mesopotamian merchants kept their records on clay tablets, which survive almost indefinitely. The Indus merchants, if they kept equivalent records, may have used palm leaves, wooden boards coated with a thin layer of clay or chalk, or other organic materials that would decompose entirely in the soil conditions of the subcontinent. The preservation environment for organic materials in the Indus region is generally poor. Humidity, seasonal flooding, and soil acidity work against the survival of anything not fired or stone. This is a genuine and important consideration, and most researchers treat it as the most likely explanation for the absence of administrative records. But the consideration does not fully resolve the problem for a reason that is sometimes passed over too quickly. If the Indus merchants used perishable materials for their records while Mesopotamian merchants used clay, then the Mesopotamian archives should contain at least some reference to the content of that trade in terms that reflect what the Indus side was communicating: contracts, letters, acknowledgments of receipt. These would carry information originating on the Indus side even if the original Indus documents had perished. And yet the Mesopotamian references to Meluhha are frustratingly generic. They list goods. They mention merchants from Meluhha living in Mesopotamian cities. They do not preserve personal names that can be matched to Indus script, do not record the names of Indus rulers or officials, do not quote from any document that appears to have originated in the Indus region. The silence, in other words, reaches even into the archives of the civilization that did keep records on clay. One interpretation is simply that trade at this period was conducted without the kind of formal written correspondence that later became standard, that goods moved through intermediaries, and that the documentation was always minimal or oral. Another interpretation is that the Meluhha references are too sparse and too late in the trade's duration to fully represent what must have been a more complex commercial relationship. Neither interpretation is wrong, but neither closes the gap. The carnelian beads sit in the display cases at the British Museum, traveled there from Ur, originally from Gujarat, and the transaction that moved them from one civilization to another left no paper trail on either end that can be read today. There is a site called Dholavira in the Rann of Kutch in what is now the Indian state of Gujarat that was unknown to archaeology until 1967 and not systematically excavated until the 1990s. It is one of the largest Indus sites ever found, covering roughly 100 hectares, and it contains something that no other Indus site has produced in quite the same form: a large inscription made of white gypsum pieces set against a darker background that once hung above or near a gateway in the northern part of the city. The inscription contained 10 signs, each roughly 30 centimeters tall, monumental by Indus standards, where most inscriptions are small enough to fit on a thumbnail. The inscription no longer exists in its original position. By the time excavators reached it, the gypsum pieces had fallen and the arrangement had partially collapsed. The signs were recorded, photographed, and studied, but their meaning remains unknown. What is known is that someone at Dholavira considered it important enough to display writing at a scale and in a location that made it visible to anyone entering that part of the city. This is the closest thing to a public inscription, the kind of commemorative or declarative text that other civilizations carved into temple walls and palace gates, that the Indus world has produced, and it cannot be read. The Dholavira inscription is significant not only for what it might say, but for what its existence implies about the others. If public display of writing was practiced at Dholavira, it may have been practiced elsewhere in materials or at locations that have not survived or have not yet been found. The inscription's monumental scale suggests that writing carried public meaning in this city, that it was not purely a private or administrative tool, but something meant to be seen, perhaps to be recognized, even if not fully read by all who passed beneath it. That possibility changes the texture of the silence elsewhere. It suggests not that writing was absent from public life in Indus cities, but that the evidence of its public use has largely vanished. Dholavira itself has other unusual features that deepen this sense of a city with a complex inner life that the material record only partially captures. The site has an elaborate system of water reservoirs, 16 of them, carved into the rock and connected by channels, representing an engineering achievement of considerable sophistication. The city's layout includes 3 distinct zones separated by walls: a citadel, a middle town, and a lower town, a tripartite division more pronounced here than at other major Indus sites. The organization implies administration, planning, and sustained civic authority over multiple centuries. And yet the identity of whoever exercised that authority remains entirely unknown. There is a burial ground at Dholavira that has been partially excavated and that contains grave structures of unusual elaborateness by Indus standards, some with multiple chambers, some with what appear to be memorial markers. The bodies themselves, in many cases, are absent. The chambers contain grave goods, but no skeletal remains, which has led to suggestions that the actual burials may have been cenotaphs, memorial structures for individuals whose bodies were disposed of elsewhere, perhaps through exposure, cremation, or river burial, practices that would leave no trace in the archaeological record. Who these memorialized individuals were, what roles they held in the city's life, whether they were the governors or priests or merchants whose authority built the reservoirs and planned the streets, the chambers do not say. They were important enough to be remembered in stone, and not important enough or not inclined to be remembered in words that have survived. What Dholavira offers, more than any other single site, is a sense of how much the Indus world may have expressed in forms that were either deliberately impermanent or simply vulnerable to time. The monumental inscription that fell, the memorial chambers emptied of their bodies, the reservoirs that still hold their shape in the rock, while the names of those who ordered them built have dissolved entirely. The site does not feel like a place that kept no records. It feels like a place whose records have been taken by different kinds of time: water, humidity, the slow work of soil, leaving behind only the stone and the silence between the signs. And those 10 unreadable signs above the gate, whatever they announced to whoever passed beneath them, still announced nothing, or everything, depending on what they were. The animals on the Indus seals have been studied for more than a century, and they remain one of the most discussed and least resolved elements of the entire civilization. The seals themselves are small. Most fit comfortably in a closed hand, and they were almost certainly used as stamps, pressed into clay to mark ownership or authorization on bundles of goods. But the imagery they carry is far more complex than simple identification would require, and that complexity has drawn researchers into questions that the seals themselves seem deliberately to resist answering. The most common animal depicted is one that does not exist. It is a creature with the body of a bull or bovine, rendered in careful profile, and a single horn projecting forward from its forehead. It stands before what appears to be a small brazier or offering stand, a detail so consistently reproduced across hundreds of seals that it cannot be accidental. This animal, sometimes called the unicorn seal, though the designation is purely descriptive, appears on more Indus seals than any other image. It is the dominant iconographic motif of an entire civilization, and no one knows what it represents. Proposals have accumulated over the decades. Some researchers argue it is a naturalistic depiction of a bull seen in strict profile, with one horn obscuring the other, a perspective trick rather than a mythological statement. Others argue that the consistent rendering across such a wide geographic area and such a long time period makes the profile view explanation unlikely, since other animals on the seals are shown with two horns quite clearly. A third position holds that the animal is genuinely mythological, a creature from a belief system that has left no other direct textual record associated with the offering stand in a ritual context that cannot now be reconstructed. The offering stand, or whatever it is, intensifies the problem. It appears only in front of the unicorn animal, not in front of the tigers, elephants, rhinoceroses, or other animals that populate the seals. It has been interpreted as an incense burner, a manger, a filter, a cult object. No excavated Indus site has produced a physical object that clearly matches it. The connection between the animal and the object, whatever the nature of that connection, was evidently so well understood by the people who used these seals that it required no further explanation. It was a shared symbol whose meaning was transparent to its users and has been opaque to everyone since. This is a particular kind of silence, not the silence of records that were never kept, but the silence of symbols whose reference have been lost. The imagery of the seals implies a rich conceptual world, a cosmology perhaps, or a system of social or commercial identity anchored in religious symbolism. Other ancient civilizations allow their iconography to be partially decoded because their textual records, even fragmentary ones, provide a framework. The mythology of Mesopotamia explains why a bull appears before a particular deity. The funerary texts of Egypt explain what the jackal-headed figure is doing beside the scales. For the Indus seals, there is no such framework. The images stand alone. There is one seal that has attracted more attention than almost any other. Found at Mohenjo-daro, and sometimes called the Pashupati seal, it depicts a horned, possibly three-faced figure seated in what some researchers describe as a yogic posture, surrounded by animals: a rhinoceros, a buffalo, an elephant, a tiger, and two deer near the figure's feet. The figure wears an elaborate headdress and appears to preside over the animals in some authoritative capacity. Some scholars have proposed that this figure is a proto-deity, a precursor to the Hindu god Shiva in his aspect as Lord of Animals. Others have argued strongly against this interpretation, pointing out that the connection depends on assumptions about religious continuity that cannot be verified across the gap of centuries and cultural discontinuity that separates the Indus world from later Hindu traditions. The debate around this single seal encapsulates a problem that runs through all interpretation of Indus imagery. The temptation to read backward from better documented later traditions, to fill the silence with meanings borrowed from elsewhere. The seal may depict something related to later Shaivite traditions. It may depict something entirely different that simply resembles those traditions superficially. The figure sits in the same posture regardless of what scholars conclude, surrounded by the same animals, wearing the same headdress, presiding over a world whose name for him has not survived. The end of the Indus Valley Civilization is where the silence shifts register entirely. It is no longer the silence of missing administrative records or unreadable scripts. It becomes the silence of a vanishing, a process by which one of the largest urban cultures of the ancient world contracted, fragmented, and effectively ceased to exist as a coherent civilization over the course of roughly 2 centuries, between approximately 1900 and 1700 BCE, leaving behind almost no account of what happened. Other civilizations that collapsed in antiquity left at least traces of the catastrophe in their own records or in the records of those who witnessed or caused it. The Indus collapse left almost nothing. The cities were abandoned, not burned. The population dispersed, not exterminated, or at least there is no clear evidence of mass extermination at most sites. And the civilization that had organized itself across nearly 1 million square kilometers simply stopped being organized, and the silence that had always characterized its record deepened into something permanent. For much of the 20th century, the explanation most widely accepted was external and violent. V. Gordon Childe, one of the most influential archaeologists of his generation, proposed that the Indus cities were destroyed by invading Indo-Aryan peoples moving into the subcontinent from the northwest, a hypothesis that gained traction partly because it seemed to align with references in the early Vedic texts to a god called Indra, destroying the fortresses of enemies sometimes called Dasyus. The skeletons found in the upper levels of Mohenjo-daro, some of them apparently unburied, some showing signs of sharp force trauma, seemed to some researchers to confirm a violent end. The invasion hypothesis was not merely academic. It carried significant political weight in the context of colonial era and post-independence debates about the origins of South Asian civilization and the relationship between its indigenous and outside elements. The hypothesis has been substantially revised and in many respects abandoned by mainstream archaeology. The skeletal evidence from Mohenjo-daro is now understood to be more complicated than early interpretations suggested. The bodies found in the upper levels represent a small number of individuals whose deaths spanned a considerable period of time and whose injuries are not uniformly consistent with massacre. The distribution of the bodies within the site does not match patterns of mass killing found at sites where violent destruction is better documented. Moreover, the decline of the Indus cities was not sudden or simultaneous. Different sites showed different trajectories. Some appear to have declined gradually over generations. Some shifted their settlement patterns rather than simply collapsing. The eastern sites in what is now Haryana and the upper reaches of the old Ghaggar-Hakra river system actually show signs of population growth during the period when the western cities were contracting. This is not the pattern of an invasion sweeping uniformly across a landscape. What the revised picture suggests, instead, is a process of gradual disintegration driven by multiple overlapping pressures, none of which the civilization appears to have successfully countered. Climate data derived from paleoclimatological studies, analysis of sediment cores, pollen records, and isotopic signatures from cave formations suggests that the region experienced a significant aridification event beginning around 2200 BCE and intensifying through the following centuries. Rivers shifted or diminished. The monsoon became less reliable. Agricultural surpluses that had sustained large urban populations and supported long-distance trade may have become harder to maintain. The Ghaggar-Hakra River system, which had supported a dense concentration of Indus settlements and which some researchers identify with the Sarasvati River described in early Vedic texts, appears to have been weakening through this period as its Himalayan glacier sources changed. But climate alone does not fully account for the pattern of the collapse, and researchers have been careful to say so. Civilizations have survived comparable climatic stresses. What made the Indus collapse so complete, so total in its erasure of urban complexity, long-distance trade networks, script use, and standardized material culture, remains a question without a satisfying answer. The civilization did not transition into something recognizably continuous. It dissolved. The script stopped being used. The standard weights disappeared. The sophisticated drainage systems fell into disrepair. Whatever administrative or religious authority had maintained coherence across such a vast territory lost its hold, and the whole did not return in any equivalent form for more than a millennium. What that authority was and how it failed, and whether those who lived through the failure understood what was ending, none of this is recorded. The silence at the end is as complete as the silence at the beginning. The Ghaggar-Hakra River system runs through what is now the border region between India and Pakistan, a seasonal or intermittent watercourse today that carries water only during and immediately after the monsoon season, spreading into shallow lakes and marshes before disappearing into the Thar Desert. For most of the year it is dry, or nearly so, a ghost river, leaving behind a broad, flat valley that preserves in its shape the memory of something much larger. Satellite imagery and geological surveys conducted over the past several decades have confirmed that this valley was once occupied by a substantial river, possibly fed by Himalayan glaciers, during and after the last ice age, capable of sustaining the dense agricultural settlements that Indus-era archaeology has found along its banks. The concentration of Indus sites along this former river is remarkable. More Indus settlements have been identified in the Ghaggar-Hakra Valley than along any other single geographic feature of the civilization's territory, including the Indus River itself. These were not small outposts. Some are substantial settlements, and the overall density suggests a population and agricultural productivity that may have rivaled or exceeded the more famous cities of the western Indus. The river was not peripheral to the civilization. It may have been central to it in ways that current maps of the Indus world do not yet fully represent. The question of when this river weakened and why has become one of the more actively debated topics in the study of the Indus collapse. Geological evidence suggests a complex history in which the river's sources changed over time. Some of its Himalayan tributaries possibly captured by other river systems through a process called river piracy, reducing its flow independently of any climate shift. The timing of these changes relative to the Indus decline is still being worked out, and different research groups have reached different conclusions about whether the river's weakening preceded, coincided with, or followed the earliest signs of urban contraction. The record, here as elsewhere, is incomplete and contested. What is less contested is that by the time the major Indus cities show clear signs of decline, the Ghaggar-Hakra system was already diminished from its earlier state. The agricultural base that the river had supported was under stress. Settlements along its banks were shifting, some moving eastward, some apparently consolidating, some simply contracting without evident relocation. The population did not disappear, but it reorganized in ways that moved away from the large, complex urban centers that had defined the civilization at its height. Whether that reorganization was driven primarily by the river's decline, by broader climate shifts, by disruptions to the trade networks that had sustained urban specialization, or by some combination of all three, remains an open question. There is an additional dimension to the river question that touches on something beyond archaeology. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the Sanskrit sacred texts, composed in a form that most scholars date to the early to middle 2nd millennium BCE, describes a great river called the Sarasvati as mighty, flowing from the mountains to the sea, the best of rivers, the best of mothers. The Sarasvati of the Rig Veda is not a minor geographical reference. It is a sacred landscape feature of considerable importance associated with ritual purity, with the origins of sacred knowledge, with the proper ordering of the world. And by the time of later Vedic texts, composed centuries after the Rig Veda, the Sarasvati has shrunk to a modest stream and eventually disappears underground, its loss mourned as a kind of sacred diminishment. Whether the Sarasvati of the Vedic texts is the Ghaggar-Hakra of the geological record is genuinely disputed. The identification is argued by some researchers and rejected by others, and the debate carries political dimensions in the modern Indian context that complicate purely academic assessment. But the possibility that the Vedic tradition preserved a memory, transformed by centuries of oral transmission and religious elaboration, of a real river that was once great and then failed, is not inherently implausible. Oral traditions in other cultures have preserved accurate geographical memories across comparable timescales. If the identification holds, then the grief encoded in the later Vedic descriptions of the Sarasvati's disappearance may be the closest thing that survives to a record of what the Indus world lost when its greatest river began to fail. It would be characteristically an indirect record, a memory of a loss transmitted through a tradition that may not have known precisely what it was remembering. Among the many categories of Indus material culture that have been recovered, the weights stand apart. They are small, often made of chert, a fine-grained stone, and they come in carefully graduated sizes, following a precise binary and decimal system, ratios of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and so on, alongside a parallel series using multiples of 10. The system is consistent. Weights found at sites separated by hundreds of miles, at Mohenjo-daro in Sindh, at Harappa in Punjab, at Lothal in Gujarat, at sites in the eastern settlements near the old Gagar-Hakra Valley, conform to the same ratios within tolerances tight enough to have functioned as a genuine standardized system of measurement. This is not the loose standardization of neighboring communities adopting compatible conventions. It is the kind of precision that implies a central authority capable of establishing, distributing, and enforcing uniform standards across an enormous territory. The implications of this are significant and underappreciated. To maintain a standardized weight system across a territory larger than modern France requires either a strong central administrative mechanism capable of producing and distributing standard weights, or a sufficiently robust commercial culture in which merchants themselves enforced conformity for practical reasons, or some combination of both. The Indus weight suggests that transactions across this civilization were conducted according to shared rules. Goods could be weighed in Lothal and their measure would be meaningful in Harappa. The system implied trust, or at least enforceability, at distances that Bronze Age logistics made genuinely difficult to manage, and yet no document records the establishment of this system. No inscription names the authority that decreed it, no archive lists the standard weights and their official values. The weights themselves are the only record, and they speak entirely through their proportions rather than through any attached explanation. They are the evidence of an administrative decision without a trace of the decision-making process. Whoever created this system, whatever office or council or individual or tradition, established these ratios and made them stick across centuries and hundreds of miles, left no name and no account. The standardized brick sizes across the civilization tell a similar story. Indus bricks follow consistent length to width to height ratios, approximately 4 to 2 to 1, across sites separated by vast distances produced locally, but conforming to a shared specification. The uniformity cannot be accidental, and it cannot be explained by independent convergence on an optimal ratio, because the ratio is specific enough that convergence without communication would be statistically implausible. Someone at some point established a standard, and that standard was adopted and maintained. How it was communicated, enforced, and sustained across centuries is entirely unknown. What the weights and bricks together suggest is an administrative culture of considerable sophistication that expressed itself almost entirely through material conformity rather than through written decree. Other ancient administrations left their authority visible in texts, laws inscribed in stone, royal proclamations, administrative correspondence. The Indus administration, if the term applies, left its authority visible in ratios, in the consistent proportions of small stone objects and fired clay blocks, repeated so reliably that they constitute a kind of signature across the entire civilization. The signature is legible, the signatory is not. This inverts the normal relationship between administration and record in the ancient world. Usually the records survive and the physical objects, the goods that were weighed, the buildings that were measured, have largely perished. In the Indus case, the goods and the buildings survive in abundance, while the records of the system that produced them have not. This inversion may be, as has been suggested, purely a function of material durability. Stone and fired brick outlast organic writing media by millennia. But the inversion is so complete and so consistent across every category of evidence that it raises a question that cannot be fully dismissed: whether the Indus administrative tradition was, by design or by cultural preference, one that concentrated authority in practice and object rather than in text and proclamation. If that is the case, if the Indus world was one in which the weight, rather than the document authorizing the weight, was the primary instrument of governance, then what has been lost is not simply a set of texts. What has been lost is a way of organizing human life that did not need to write itself down to function across 1,000,000 square kilometers for 7 centuries. And that possibility, if it holds, says something not only about the Indus Valley, but about the range of forms that complex civilization can take, a range wider than the surviving record of the ancient world normally suggests. The port city of Lothal, situated near the Gulf of Khambat on the western coast of what is now Gujarat, was excavated between 1955 and 1960 by the Archaeological Survey of India under the direction of S.R. Rao. What emerged from those excavations was a site that complicated the already complex picture of Indus organization in ways that have not been fully resolved. Lothal contained what Rao identified as a dockyard, a large rectangular basin, roughly 217 meters long and 37 meters wide, constructed of fired brick with inlet and outlet channels designed to maintain a consistent water level regardless of tidal variation. If the identification is correct, it represents one of the earliest purpose-built maritime structures in the world, and it implies a level of tidal engineering knowledge that was not previously associated with Bronze Age South Asia. The identification has been disputed. Some researchers have argued that the basin was not a dockyard, but a large irrigation reservoir or a water storage facility, pointing to its distance from the nearest navigable channel and questioning whether the tidal range at Lothal during the Indus period would have been sufficient to make a tidal dockyard functional. Rao and those who followed his interpretation maintained that the geography of the coastline and the river system in the 3rd millennium BCE was significantly different from today, and that the basin's construction details, the inlet channel, the spillway, the careful brick lining, are more consistent with maritime use than with simple water storage. The debate has continued for decades without definitive resolution, largely because the environmental reconstruction of the ancient coastline remains incomplete. What is less disputed is that Lothal was a center of manufacturing and trade. The site contains warehouses, workshops producing carnelian and shell beads of types found at Indus sites across the entire civilization, and at Mesopotamian sites far to the west, a residential area, and a small cemetery. Persian Gulf shells found at the site indicate contact with the maritime world to the west. The bead workshop at Lothal produced objects of sufficient refinement and in sufficient quantity to supply not only local demand but export markets. The distinctive etched carnelian beads that appear in royal graves at almost certainly passed through manufacturing centers like Lothal at some stage of their journey. And yet the records of that manufacturing and export activity are absent in the same way they are absent everywhere in the Indus world. No shipping manifest, no account of goods received or dispatched, no correspondence with trading partners. Lothal possessed, according to its excavators, a standardized system of weights consistent with the broader Indus system, and seals were found that would have been used to mark packages and authorize transactions. But the transactions themselves, the commercial life that the warehouse and the bead workshop and the possible dockyard together imply, exists only in the negative space defined by the objects left behind, not in any text that describes it. There is something particular about Lothal's silence that differs slightly from the silence of the inland cities. Mohenjo-daro and Harappa are interior sites where the absence of records can be attributed, at least in part, to the general conditions of preservation in the region. Lothal is a coastal trading site whose entire reason for existence was connection with other Indus settlements, connection with the Persian Gulf trade network, connection with the wider commercial world of the Bronze Age Indian Ocean. It was, by definition, a point of contact between the Indus world and others. And it is precisely at this point of contact where the Indus world interfaced with civilizations that did keep readable records that the Indus silence is most conspicuous. The Mesopotamian traders who received carnelian beads from workshops like Lothal's left records, fragmentary, generic, frustratingly imprecise, but records nonetheless. The Indus traders who produced and shipped those beads left the beads. The asymmetry has a slightly vertiginous quality when examined closely. The same commercial relationship, the same network, the same exchange, preserved from one end in words and from the other in stone. It is as if one side of a conversation has survived and the other has been replaced by the objects the conversation was about. The objects are eloquent in their own way, but they cannot explain themselves, and the words that once accompanied them, if words there were, have gone the way of the organic materials on which, perhaps, they were written. Lothal sits today as a low mound in the flat agricultural landscape of Gujarat, accessible by road, partially reconstructed for visitors, its possible dockyard visible as a large rectangular depression in the earth. Gulls pass over it from the coast, which is no longer as close as it once was. The question of religion in the Indus Valley civilization is one that archaeology approaches with particular caution, because it is also one where the temptation to project later traditions backward has historically been strongest. The caution is warranted. The Indus world predates the composition of the Vedic texts by centuries, and the relationship between Indus religious practice, to whatever extent it can be inferred from material evidence, and the religious traditions that later developed in South Asia, is a question that carries significant interpretive and political weight. Careful researchers tend to describe what is found and resist the urge to name it with the vocabulary of later traditions. The restraint is appropriate. It is also, in its own way, a form of the silence. What the material evidence does suggest, without overinterpretation, is that water played a central role in whatever ritual life the Indus cities organized. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-daro is the most prominent example, but it is not the only one. Other Indus sites contain large water tanks or bathing platforms that appear to have been designed for communal use rather than purely practical sanitation. The care taken in their construction, the careful waterproofing of the Great Bath using bitumen-sealed bricks, the provision of steps for entry, the apparent separation of these spaces from ordinary domestic areas, suggests that water contact in these contexts was meaningful in ways beyond hygiene. The elaborateness of the infrastructure implies ritual. What the ritual was, who performed it, and what cosmological framework gave it meaning cannot be determined from the structure alone. Small figurines recovered from Indus sites add another layer of incomplete evidence. Female figurines, often elaborately decorated with headdresses and jewelry, appear at many sites and have been interpreted by some researchers as representations of a mother goddess or fertility deity. The interpretation is plausible, but not demonstrable. Similar figurines appear in many ancient cultures without necessarily indicating goddess worship in any specific theological sense. They may represent ancestors, idealized humans, ritual objects for domestic use, or things that resist modern categorical description. The Indus figurines are consistent with a religious tradition that honored female forms in some way, but the nature of that honoring is opaque. Male figures are rarer, but not absent. The so-called priest-king statue from Mohenjo-daro, a small sculpture of a bearded man wearing a robe decorated with trefoil patterns, his eyes half closed in what some describe as a meditative expression, is one of the most discussed objects from the entire civilization. The name given to it is entirely an interpretive imposition. Nothing about the object identifies it as depicting either a priest or a king, and the designation reflects early excavators' assumption that such a carefully crafted figure must represent someone of high status, who combined religious and political authority. The figure may indeed represent such a person. It may represent an ancestor, a deity, an idealized human, or something else entirely. The trefoil decoration has been found on other Indus objects, suggesting it carried symbolic significance, but what that significance was is unknown. The absence of identifiable temples is particularly striking when considered alongside the evidence for water ritual and symbolic imagery. If the Indus cities had a formal religious life, and the evidence of the Great Bath and the elaborate seal iconography suggests they did, where was it institutionally housed? In Mesopotamia, temples were the largest and most dominant structures in the urban landscape, centers of economic as well as religious life, staffed by priests who kept records and administered significant portions of the city's resources. In Egypt, temple complexes were among the most durably constructed buildings in the entire civilization. In the Indus cities, nothing comparable has been clearly identified. Either the religious architecture looked different enough from Mesopotamian and Egyptian models that it has not been recognized, or it was constructed in more perishable materials, or the institutional structure of Indus religion was genuinely different, more distributed, more domestic, more embedded in ordinary civic spaces like the baths, than the centralized temple models familiar from other ancient civilizations. That last possibility is perhaps the most interesting and the hardest to evaluate. A religion without a temple, or with the bath as its temple, the street as its processional way, the domestic courtyard as its shrine, would leave a material record quite different from what archaeology normally looks for when searching for evidence of religious life. It would leave water tanks and figurines and seal impressions and the faint traces of practices conducted in spaces that doubled as everything else, which is, more or less, what the Indus world has left. Whether that constitutes evidence of a specific kind of religious organization or simply the absence of a different kind remains genuinely open. In 1946, a British archaeologist named Mortimer Wheeler arrived at Harappa to conduct a new round of systematic excavations using stratigraphic methods more rigorous than those applied during the initial discoveries of the 1920s. Wheeler was a meticulous excavator and a forceful intellectual presence, and his work at Harappa and subsequently at Mohenjo-daro significantly advanced the technical understanding of the sites. He was also responsible, more than anyone else, for popularizing the invasion hypothesis, the idea that the Indus cities had been destroyed by incoming Indo-Aryan peoples, and for framing the Indus Civilization in ways that would influence scholarship for decades. His interpretations were not always correct, and some have been substantially revised. But his excavations produced stratigraphic data that remains important, and his influence on how the civilization was understood and presented to the wider world was considerable. What Wheeler's work also did, less intentionally, was to fix certain interpretive frameworks around the Indus sites that proved difficult to dislodge even as new evidence accumulated. The division of Mohenjo-daro into citadel and lower city, the identification of the large rectangular structure on the citadel as a granary, the reading of the unburied skeletons as massacre victims. These interpretations entered the literature with Wheeler's authority behind them and persisted long after the evidence for them had been questioned. The granary identification in particular has been substantially challenged. Later analysis found no grain residue in the structure, and its internal organization does not clearly match the functional requirements of bulk grain storage. The structure's actual purpose remains unknown, which is a less dramatic conclusion than granary, but a more honest one. This is not a criticism of Wheeler specifically. It is an observation about how interpretation works in archaeology, particularly when dealing with a civilization that has left so little textual self-explanation. In the absence of documents, physical structures must carry more interpretive weight than they can reliably bear. A large building must be something: a granary, an assembly hall, a temple, a palace, because the human mind resists the conclusion that a significant structure might have served a purpose for which no modern category exists, or that its purpose might simply be unknown. The pressure to name and classify is understandable. It is also, in the Indus case, consistently productive of conclusions that later evidence complicates or refutes. The pattern of reinterpretation runs through the entire history of Indus scholarship. The Great Bath was identified as a ritual bathing tank early in its excavation history and has largely retained that identification, but the evidence for ritual use is inferential rather than demonstrable. The Pashupati seal was identified as depicting a proto-Shiva figure within years of its discovery, and that identification has been challenged repeatedly without being entirely displaced. The female figurines were classified as goddess representations and continue to be so described in many popular accounts despite sustained academic skepticism. Each of these interpretations filled a silence with a plausible story, and the plausible story, once told, acquired a kind of momentum that made it harder to hold the silence open. The problem is structural. The Indus civilization invites interpretation precisely because it is so materially rich and textually empty. There is enough physical evidence to generate compelling hypotheses and not enough textual evidence to test them. The result is a field that has produced a considerable body of interpretation, resting on a surprisingly narrow base of verifiable fact, and a public understanding of the civilization that is, in some ways, more confident than the evidence warrants. Popular accounts of the Indus world often describe it in terms: peaceful traders, egalitarian society, sophisticated urban planners, that reflect genuine patterns in the evidence, but also reflect the interpretive choices of scholars working in specific historical and intellectual contexts. The egalitarian reading, for instance, is based on the relatively modest differentiation in burial wealth and the absence of obvious palace architecture. These are real patterns, but the absence of extreme inequality in the surviving record is not the same as the presence of equality in the actual society. A society can be highly stratified in ways that leave little material trace, through control of information, through ritual authority, through hereditary access to trade networks, without producing the dramatic wealth differentials visible in royal tombs. The Indus world may have been more equal than contemporary Mesopotamia and Egypt. It may also have been stratified in ways that the current evidence simply cannot detect. Both remain possible, and the honest position holds them both open simultaneously. That honesty is rarer in the popular literature than in the academic literature, and the gap between what the evidence supports and what accounts of the civilization typically claim has itself become a kind of secondary silence. The silence of complexity replaced by the noise of confident narrative. The relationship between the Indus Valley civilization and the cultures that followed it in South Asia is a question that sits at the intersection of archaeology, linguistics, genetics, and politics, and it is one where the evidence has been changing rapidly enough in the past 2 decades that conclusions reached even 15 years ago require significant qualification today. The central question is one of continuity. How much of what the Indus world built, believed, and practiced survived its collapse, and in what form, and through what channels, and into which of the traditions that subsequently developed in the subcontinent? For much of the 20th century, the dominant framing was one of rupture. The invasion hypothesis implied not merely military conquest, but cultural replacement. The sophisticated Indus urban tradition swept away by incoming peoples who brought a different language, a different religion, and a different social organization. In this framing, the Vedic tradition that produced the earliest Sanskrit texts was fundamentally external to the Indus world, arriving from outside and establishing itself on territory that the Indus civilization had vacated. The continuities between Indus material culture and later South Asian traditions were acknowledged but treated as minor or superficial. The genetic evidence that has accumulated over the past decade has complicated this picture considerably. Ancient DNA studies conducted on skeletal remains from Indus period sites, a technically demanding undertaking given the poor preservation conditions, have begun to provide data on the ancestry of Indus populations and their relationship to later populations in the subcontinent. The emerging picture is one of significant population movement into South Asia during the 2nd millennium BCE, consistent with the arrival of peoples from the Eurasian steppe, whose descendants contributed substantially to the ancestry of present-day populations across northern South Asia. This movement appears to have occurred after the Indus urban phase had already begun its decline, suggesting that it was not the primary cause of that decline, but it was substantial enough to have influenced the genetic and cultural landscape of the post-Indus period considerably, At the same time, the genetic data also indicates significant continuity between Indus period populations and later South Asian populations, particularly in the south and west of the subcontinent. The picture is not one of simple replacement, it is one of admixture, of multiple ancestral streams flowing together in different proportions in different regions, producing the genetically diverse and culturally complex landscape of later South Asia. Some portion of what the Indus people were, biologically and perhaps culturally, persisted into the civilizations that followed, transformed but not erased. What this means for the question of cultural continuity is still being worked out, and the working out is complicated by the fact that genetic continuity and cultural continuity are not the same thing. A population can persist while adopting an entirely new language and religious tradition. A cultural practice can survive through transmission to people of quite different ancestry. The relationship between the biological descendants of the Indus population and the inheritors of Indus cultural traditions, if there are such inheritors, cannot be read directly from the genetic data. It requires the kind of comparative cultural analysis that is itself dependent on the interpretive frameworks already discussed, frameworks that are themselves contested. There are specific material continuities that some researchers have identified as significant. Certain pottery traditions show unbroken development from Indus period forms into post-Indus regional styles. Some architectural practices, the use of specific brick ratios, certain approaches to drainage, particular configurations of domestic space, appear to persist in modified form in post-Indus settlements. The use of ritual bathing, deeply embedded in later South Asian religious practice across multiple traditions, may connect to the water rituals suggested by the Great Bath and the bathing platforms of Indus cities, though the connection cannot be demonstrated directly given the absence of textual continuity. These threads are suggestive but fragile. They could represent genuine continuity of practice transmitted across the collapse. They could represent independent convergence on similar solutions to similar problems. Without written records bridging the gap, the two possibilities cannot be cleanly distinguished. The civilization that ended left something in the soil and possibly in the practices of the people who survived it. But what exactly was transmitted and how, and whether those who transmitted it knew they were doing so, is a question the record cannot currently answer. The Indus world flows into the subsequent history of South Asia, not as a visible river, but as groundwater, present in what grows above it, invisible in itself, its precise contribution to the landscape above impossible to fully trace. There is a particular kind of frustration that runs through the careers of researchers who have devoted years or decades to the Indus script, and it is worth pausing on that frustration not as a human interest detail, but as a diagnostic symptom. The frustration is not simply the ordinary difficulty of hard problems. It has a specific texture that distinguishes it from, say, the frustration of a mathematician working on an unsolved proof, or a physicist confronting recalcitrant experimental data. It is the frustration of a problem that looks as though it should be solvable, that has enough material, enough comparative context, enough computational power now available to it, and that nonetheless resists solution in a way that begins to feel structural rather than merely difficult. Attempts to decode the Indus script have followed several broad approaches. The oldest and most persistent is comparative, looking for structural similarities between the Indus signs and other ancient scripts whose underlying languages are known, hoping that resemblance in form might indicate resemblance in function or origin. This approach has produced numerous proposals, connections to Proto-Elamite, to Brahmi, to various Dravidian writing systems, none of which has achieved anything approaching consensus. The structural similarities identified have generally been judged too superficial or too selective to constitute genuine genetic relationship between script systems. A second approach has been statistical and computational. If the Indus script encodes a spoken language, it should exhibit statistical properties consistent with language, certain patterns of sign frequency, certain combinatorial rules about which signs follow each others, certain distributions that distinguish phonetic writing from logographic writing from purely symbolic notation. Computational analyses of the Indus corpus have been conducted by multiple research groups, and they have produced some interesting findings. The sign combinations do appear to follow rules. They are not random, and some analyses have suggested that the statistical properties of the corpus are more consistent with a linguistic system than with a purely symbolic one. But statistical consistency with language is not the same as decipherment. Knowing that a system probably encodes speech does not reveal what speech it encodes, in what language, or how the signs map to sounds or meanings. A third approach has been to work from bilingual or near bilingual evidence, the Mesopotamian texts mentioning Meluha, any Indus objects found in non-Indus contexts that might carry identifying information, any external source that might provide a phonetic key to even a handful of Indus signs. This approach has produced the least because the external evidence is so sparse and so nonspecific. The Mesopotamian texts name Meluha, but do not transcribe Indus words. The Indus objects found in Mesopotamian contexts are seals that carry Indus signs, but no translation. The bilingual inscription that would unlock the script, the equivalent of the Rosetta Stone, has not been found, and there is no particular reason to expect that it exists, or that it would have survived if it did. The cumulative effect of these failed or stalled approaches has been to produce a field characterized by a large number of proposed decipherments, none of which has been accepted, and a corresponding skepticism among mainstream researchers about any new proposal. The dynamic is self-reinforcing. The proliferation of rejected decipherments has made the field cautious to the point of near paralysis, while the caution ensures that even proposals with genuine merit receive immediate and intense scrutiny. Several researchers who have proposed partial decipherments, readings of specific signs or sign combinations that they believe can be supported by comparative evidence, have found their work either largely ignored or subjected to criticism that, in some cases, apply stricter standards than those applied to accepted decipherments of other ancient scripts. The situation with the Indus script is, in some ways, unprecedented in the study of ancient writing. Other undeciphered scripts, Linear A, Proto-Sinaitic in its earlier stages, the Rongorongo script of Easter Island, face their own distinctive obstacles. But the Indus script is unique in combining a very large corpus of inscriptions with consistently very short texts, an entirely unknown underlying language, no bilingual key, and a civilization that has left no other textual tradition that might provide indirect access to its vocabulary or grammar. Each of these obstacles would be significant alone. Together, they create a situation in which conventional decipherment methodology has no clear point of entry. What remains is the corpus itself, 5,000 inscribed objects, roughly 400 to 600 signs, combinations that follow rules no one has yet succeeded in reading. The signs are clear. They were cut by skilled hands into hard stone, pressed into wet clay, scratched into pottery. They were meant to communicate something to someone, that someone understood them. The understanding died with the civilization, or was transformed so completely in transmission that it left no key. And the signs, patient and exact, continue to mean whatever they always meant to no one who can now receive them. There is a thought that occurs quietly to anyone who has spent enough time with the Indus evidence, that the civilization may not have been silent so much as legible in a register that has not yet been found, that what appears as absence may be presence in a form that current frameworks of inquiry are not equipped to recognize. This is not a comfortable thought because it cannot be tested, and untestable thoughts have a way of becoming convenient excuses for the limits of understanding. But it persists, and it persists for reasons that are worth examining rather than dismissing. Every civilization that has been successfully studied in depth has been studied partly through the recovery of its own self-description. Egypt is understood because Egypt described itself obsessively in stone and papyrus across millennia. Mesopotamia is understood because its scribes recorded everything from royal hymns to grain deliveries on clay tablets that the soil preserved. Greece and Rome are understood because their texts survived, directly or through medieval copies, into a world still capable of reading them. Even civilizations whose writing was initially undeciphered, Mycenaean Greece, whose Linear B tablets were decoded in 1952, became legible once the script was cracked, because behind the script there was a language, and behind the language there was a world of administrative and economic description that opened like a door. The Indus world has not offered that door, and what becomes apparent the longer the absence is examined is that the tools developed to understand other ancient civilizations were developed in dialogue with those civilizations' own communicative preferences. The methods of ancient history, of epigraphy, of textual archaeology were honed on cultures that express themselves in ways those methods were built to recover. The Indus world may have expressed itself differently in ratios, in material conformity, in the distribution of standardized objects across enormous distances, in water, and in the careful geometry of streets. And the methods built for textual civilizations may be systematically underprepared for what the Indus world was actually saying. This is speculative, and the speculation must be held loosely, but it is not baseless. The standardized weights, the uniform bricks, the sophisticated drainage maintained across centuries, the trade network sustained without apparent coercion across a territory larger than any contemporary empire. These are communications of a kind. They say, we agree. They say, we share a system. They say, what is made here will be recognized there. They constitute a kind of distributed text written not in signs on stone, but in the consistent behavior of millions of people across hundreds of miles over hundreds of years. Whether that constitutes writing in any meaningful sense is a philosophical question rather than an archaeological one. but it raises the possibility that the Indus world was not a civilization that failed to record itself. It was a civilization that recorded itself in forms that erode and in practices that transform, and in the bodies of people who survived its ending and carried fragments of its knowledge into the traditions that followed, where those fragments became unattributable and indistinguishable from everything else that accumulated around them. What the Indus Valley Civilization chose to make permanent is instructive. It made its drainage systems permanent. It made its weights permanent. It made its seals permanent. It made the small carved animals permanent. The unicorn before its offering stand, the humped bull, the tiger, the elephant, the figure seated among beasts. It made the great bath permanent, waterproofed against leakage, stepped for descent. These are the things it committed to stone and fired clay, and careful construction. Not the names of rulers, not the decrees of priests, not the accounts of merchants, not the records of battles. Whatever the civilization understood as worth preserving against time, it was not what other Bronze Age civilizations understood as worth preserving. Whether that reflects a different cosmology, a different relationship to power, a different theory of what lasts and what matters, or simply a different set of practical choices about writing materials, is a question that may never be answerable. The seals continue to be found. New sites continue to emerge from the soil of Pakistan and India, some through systematic excavation, some through construction work, some through the slow erosion of riverbanks. Each new find adds to a corpus that is already large enough to have been studied for a century without yielding its central secret. The signs accumulate. The silence accumulates with them, not deepening exactly, but widening, spreading to include more evidence that points in the same direction without arriving at a destination. Somewhere beneath agricultural fields in Sindh and Punjab and Gujarat and Haryana, the rest of the civilization waits in the dark of the soil, neither offering itself nor withholding itself, simply present in the way that buried things are present, patient, indifferent to the questions being asked above them, holding whatever they hold in the particular silence of things that have outlasted their own meaning.